It is an attempt to turn imprecise English language into not machine runnable code, but something that is more precise than just words.
I think one way to think about the protocol versus direct integration one-to-one client server is this idea of the Cathedral and the Bazaar. What's so interesting about protocol creation is the people who create protocols have to understand the problem better than anyone else. Hello everyone, this is another context episode, and this time I'm here with Ilya Grigorik, and we are going to talk about why protocols are such an important thing that engineers talk about. And in fact, I think if you do our job right, you are going to have a much stronger appreciation for the protocols that run the modern world, that underpin the world of engineering, and what makes a protocol, what makes them good, and why it's a thing that when you probably find yourself at some place, even if you're not in engineering, and you buy drinks for engineers and get them onto their most philosophical self and into the topics of internet history, you will at some point hear about protocols, and then next time you'll have hopefully something interesting to contribute to those conversations. Ilya, you have worked on a lot of important protocols of the internet in your career. Obviously, the largest one of those is the W3C, the internet body that specifies what web browsers are allowed to do. HTML is one of those protocols, I suppose. I guess HTTP is definitely the thing that makes all web browsers work, which is something you have worked on. And most recently on UCP, which we talk a lot about because it's enabling the agentic world. And so, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah.
Let's quickly start with, HTTP. Tell us a bit about that protocol, the sort of origin of it.
Oh, that's a fascinating story. I think the key insight from HTTP is Tim Berners-Lee I don't know if he deliberately made these decisions, but he walked into a design that evolved that we can learn from. So if you look at the very first iteration of HTTP, it was literally one line that you would type in, and it says get with the name of the resource. It is the simplest thing that you could imagine, and it worked.
It's not machine language. It's not.
No, it was literally three letters, get, followed by the name of the resource. It's as simple as it can get. That is HTTP 0.9. Yeah. It is kind of protocol. It can only do one thing at a time. It does not understand different resources, but it worked. And
everyone has seen this a million times. You've looked at the address bar in your browser. It says HTTP, usually HTTPS now, because he had to make it secure at some point. He sort of skipped over that back in the day. But
that came later, right? But then you forward evolved that, and what happened was there's this Cambrian explosion of people building stuff because they said, hey, this is cool. There's something here. So then somebody comes along and says, it'd be cool if you could fetch an image, but how do we differentiate that? And so headers come into existence. And headers, one of the key decisions at the time was it's an open protocol. So there was no central governing body. Tim did not sit there and approve every proposal for every header that said, this is how you do it. Instead, it was community of server builders. And then there's a growing community of client builders who just said, look, we're just going to try stuff, right? We're going to throw some stuff at the wall. Hey, Apache server, if you add this header and I will add this listener on the other side, then the two of us can negotiate, and now we can speak images, and look, ta-da, right? And this is the genesis of the internet as we know it.
Yes.
There's this Cambrian explosion of experimentation, and it's lawless.
Yeah.
People are just doing stuff, and they're experimenting. And then after the fact, smart people come together and say, look, we've tried 5 different variants of how to negotiate an image. Let's just agree on a convention.
Yes.
And that becomes the IETF lore, and there's RFCs that get put out. But note that it is not by consent or approval of somebody. Tim was never in the way.
What does RFC stand for?
A request for comments.
But even that's kind of like prosaic in a way, right?
Exactly.
It's not like a law.
Exactly. It is, you put it, it becomes standardized, but it is still a request for comments,
That's right? So everyone can put an RFC together. It's almost like its own sort of, it almost looks a little bit like engineer tinged legalese, there's a particular, a should and must, and often uppercased, and at least in some areas. So it's where there's there's an aesthetic to how to put up an RFC,
right.
And you get a number assigned, or maybe you pick it.
It is our best attempt, well, maybe not best, it is an attempt to turn imprecise English language into not machine runnable code, but something that is more precise than just words, right? Such that you could bring somebody on the other side could implement it in a more like respectful way.
Which, by the way, is also like what the legal language is, right? Like
Exactly.
It's usually starts with a variable definition at the top of terms, and then it goes into like a subset of English language, which is more or less executable, and then it all kind of is committed to the source code by case law, right? Like it's or by into the monorepo, so to speak, at least in the common law area of the world. And so so it's like you make a request for comments because you want to make a change, or you want to make an enhancement, or you want to specify something that already works, which is actually also an interesting, like very often an RFC is happening for something that's almost backwards facing documenting about something that someone has already tried.
That is key, right? So it is, an RFC is just another step in kind of a market negotiation mechanism, because the way the internet still operates is, we can set up a server right now and invent a whole bunch of new headers.
And so that is the thing that was like that HTTP, like, I mean, the day before HTTP, basically, it was like a network of a traditional sense. You would make a piece of client software and a piece of server software, and they could sort of talk to each other over a socket, right? Like, and the genius of the protocol in the middle meant that now it wasn't the same person who had to make the server and the client. There was like one client, and whatever that client supported, it could always send a prophylactic request to the HTTP server you put into the address bar. And if it got a response back, it would then show this. Therefore, what the protocol allowed to do is a end-to-end collaboration. Like suddenly every server could talk to every other server,
right.
Or like every other client by just sort of trying it, right, and seeing if something came back.
Yeah, and the important part for the protocol itself was to establish that negotiation mechanism, right? So if now we wanted to add support for compression, because that turns out to be useful, you just have to negotiate. We have to specify how to negotiate that capability.
Okay, right. You sent your request saying you would accept compressed version of a content.
Exactly.
And literally is no, it's not an accept header. But you, and then if a server decided, like, I have no idea what you're talking about, it just sends a plain text, and that's also okay.
Right, because you advertise that you support fancy zip. I don't know fancy zip. But if you come back to me with a different request, maybe I will respect it.
So this is fascinating. And then, of course, HTTP evolved a lot, and it's gotten a lot better since with HTTP 2 and 3 and so on. You worked on 2, I think, and 3, foundations for 3, so which is very, very good nerd credit, very nice work. I think what's so interesting about it, though, is like some people listen to this and they're like, well, that sounds not exactly like engineering. This sounds very ad hoc, right? And very, like engineering is supposed to, you have blueprints, you build a bridge in a world where gravity doesn't change. You figure out what the tolerances are, and then you build on tolerances, and if you, within the margins of the tolerances, you can decide to optimize for cost or optimize for beauty or, the Golden Gate Bridge and the random bridge over the local river all like work on the same principle, but like different decisions were made based on the envelope of the project. So there's some variance in there, but no fundamental, like sort of almost market-like price finding. And this really is messy. Like, for instance, I think HTTP famously misspelled the word referrer in it. Yes. And that's just in the spec. Did we ever actually fix this? Or?
No, it's still a thing.
Yeah. So I'm pretty sure in 1,000 years or 100 years, the official spelling of referrer will at some point just like flip. I think every dictionary already accepts it the way it's written in the HTTP standard as not wrong, at least, because it's so commonly used. But it's just like someone misspelled it, I suppose, at some point.
Yeah. I think it's a different type of engineering. So protocol design is just like, it's reasoning about abstractions. You can reason about data abstractions, data model abstractions, API abstractions. A open protocol like HTTP is an abstraction for you to negotiate amongst many different participants in the ecosystem of what you're willing to accept, what you're willing to negotiate, and how are you going to communicate with each other. So it is done right. It gets out of the way and allows you to do things that you wouldn't be able to otherwise.
Yeah, and so the consequence like, again, really, really nerdy topic here, but then the consequences of this are basically the world we all live in. Like everyone here at Shopify has the job, which I think hopefully we love and appreciate because of these messy protocol creation exercises early in the, I guess 70s, 80s, 90s. Because, at some point in 2004, I could just take a random computer connected to the internet and I could respond to port 80 and hopefully to 443 as well to just launch a piece of software that I wrote with nothing else than just like listen to these two ports on the internet. And if a request arrived that asked for the Snow Devil or any of the files and paths there, it sent back e-commerce website, and it had in it like a checkout, which
soup of XML tags that happened to me. Checkout flares.
Exactly, and it just like it like to computer there is no such thing as Snow Devil or a checkout, but like that doesn't matter. Like no one had to pre-plan the fact that e-commerce might happen in HTTP. In fact, they tried and then we didn't sort of listen, I suppose, with 4.2 status code. But anyway, that's a different topic. So this is sort of, and then protocols are really all around us. Like obviously computers talk to each other over DNS, which is a protocol, and then obviously they package everything into container-like packets called in something called TCP/IP, which is the reason why anything in this on the internet even works. In a very real way, although it might be just on the margins of a word protocol, and you can pick on which side it's lying. But like Liquid feels like a protocol because it's a way for designers to state the online store they would like to be responded with when someone comes asking for it, and a couple of rules related to what products to show and so on. And those are provided to Shopify, the software, and then Shopify uses its current best way of turning this into a real online store and sending it back. And that's basically what Shopify has been doing for those 20 years it's existed. There's a couple of protocols that are really important, and why it's fun to talk about them is, HTTP is a little bit special because it somehow finagled its way to the browser bar, and therefore we actually are aware of it. But really, when a protocol truly works, it's invisible. The only protocols that people know about are the ones that are really like wrong in important ways, and therefore everyone's complaining about them, or they will never have heard of them because they didn't get adopted. And so one of the aspects of protocols is that they allow a lot of different people to openly collaborate. I think that's one of the just absolute, like, I think that needs to be true for a protocol to be successful.
A protocol it's a language and a set of rules by which you achieve an outcome, right? So that can be Liquid because you've defined a templating system and you learn that language and you achieve your outcome. Ruby is exceptional at DSLs.
Yes.
Those are protocols. Every time you invent some DSL for configuring, like for defining your config or something else, you're defining yet another protocol and a set of conventions, right? And they succeed and die by their merit and their ability to like help you do the things that you need to do.
That's right. People query their own data in Shopify with Shopify QL, which is a language protocol. The amazing thing is this has existed for a very long time. We've had Shopify QL for, I think, over 10 years, maybe actually much longer, I think, 15 maybe. And nothing about how Shopify QL is executed is the same, right? Like the same query works. You can still ask for your orders based on the weekday, but we can take the same packet that you stated and now execute them in a completely, like everything about the way Shopify is deployed, it's on different data centers, it's like, it's scaled to the entire world, it's like all these kind of things. So I think this is what protocols also enable, that there can be progress, protocols don't calcify progress in the same way that a lot of, just like monolithic software does. Let's talk about let's fast forward to today. I think one way to think about the protocol versus direct integration one-to-one client server is this idea of like the Cathedral and the Bazaar. and which seems always super appropriate thing to talk about for us in commerce.
Yep. So we talked about open protocols already, and the need for kind of market making market making is actually the opposite. You want to facilitate the market to negotiate what they want to talk about, right? So we talked about HTTP and how servers and clients could negotiate themselves without having IETF ratify and specify every compression algorithm, right? We can invent one ourselves. I think same thing applies for commerce. You can model commerce as a cathedral. You could say, here is the one true flavor of checkout.
Yes, it can be cathedrals can be very fancy. They can have lots of nooks and crannies.
Kind of by definition, I would say they are more fancy in many regards because you can have architects that define precisely what they want with the level of flourish that you can't in a kind of open market participant, right?
They are obviously impressive. They are obviously, they feel structured, they feel trustworthy. It's like in a very visceral sense, you walk up to a cathedral and you're in a place of incredible deliberation.
You just look up and you stare in awe, right?
Yes,
and then right beside it is the Bazaar, and the Bazaar has a very different, you look far and wide and you go, oh my God, there's so much variety here. There's so much...
And chaos. And crazy. And
Exactly. And
someone selling rotisserie chickens and in the middle of people selling bales of cloth. And it's just none of it makes any sense.
Right. Some of it you can barter, some of it you need stable coins for, some of it you need fiat currency, some double delivery, the list goes on and on and on.
That's right.
And both need to coexist. And this is the difference between kind of a closed protocol where you can control everything end to end cathedral because you have the blueprint for the cathedral and you've told everyone to build to this exact spec. But there's no blueprint for the Bazaar, right? It is just kind of controlled chaos.
It's not even the same Bazaar, even 3 hours later, right? It's completely changes based on
because the participants chose to swap out the rotisserie chicken stand for something else because it wasn't selling.
Exactly. So it's it's absolutely it's chaotic. It doesn't look impressive. You look up and see nothing. You're up here. You're in fact it's intimidating probably first time you walk up to it. It's how do you even make sense?
Right.
No one knows. You ask someone, hey, where can I find these goods? You have no idea because again, tomorrow the whole thing is going to be different depending on when someone shows up where.
So now the fun challenge. So it's not easy, but kind of obvious how you build a protocol for the cathedral.
Yeah.
Because, well, by definition, it's a blueprint, right? How do you build a protocol for the Bazaar? That is the hard problem.
And this is why I brought an expert onto the show.
Yes, I specialize in Bazaar.
How do you write a protocol for Bazaar?
Well, we just talked about it. HTTP is a good example, right? You do not establish the blueprint for every type of negotiation, what type of goods can be sold in what form, with what payment methods. Instead, you define a protocol by which the two sides can negotiate. And then you get out of the way and you facilitate that open Bazaar of innovation.
That's right. There are the Bazaar has parameters. They are enforced in very different ways in different places. But you obviously can't go and just make one stand that fills the entire market or so. Just you can't. Presumably, you can't use force to avoid having competitors. And there are rules. They are just organic in a way, how they were established, and they eventually become culture of a place.
Right. So, and some of those are operational in how you deploy it, right? And some of them, as you said, at the protocols, how do you negotiate those differences? And the hard part of this is understanding of what is your responsibility. Good protocols know their boundaries, right? Because they know how to layer themselves to build on top. So they're not trying to reach too far up or too far down. And they establish this abstraction where they're satisfied that intersection of here's what one side of the market is willing to offer, here is what the other side of the market is willing to implement, and then how to facilitate that exchange in the middle.
And it's so that then, again, literally a market emerges and sees if there's price finding, you figure out, again, all these kind of things happen. But it's really, the reason why it's such a fun metaphor is because I think people know that both of those things work. And even though you would imagine there is a better solution. They usually, people have a bias towards there being the one true solution for everything, but usually they often, even the extremes of the spectrum actually are both perfectly viable. And so Shopify obviously is a company that's like, we are Bazaar. Like if Shopify would be, it would be so fun to see Shopify as like an actual Bazaar, like visualized with a crazy variety of shops and a crazy amount of commerce and crazy amount of ideas and the crazy amount of people that are coming to all these stores. There's like Alo Yoga next to the hardware shop next to like, it's just like, it would be absolutely mad and it would be wonderful.
Yeah.
And so every one of those businesses is really uniquely their own. Specifically, often people think that there's like small businesses are like simple and then big businesses are complex. Very often, actually, this winds up being wrong. Maybe they're just both complex, or sometimes the really, really big ones can actually be quite simple. Like
that's right.
Alo Yoga has a huge amount, it's our largest store, is like a huge amount of features they're using from Shopify, but it really fits into extremely well operationally run clothing business from central casting, and where there's like the maddest like streetwear companies that only sell food drops, or that you can't even qualify for a drop if you're not in a particular location, or if you haven't already successfully gotten 5 other things. Like my favorite is like, there's a computer hardware company called Final Mouse, which has this whole thing about every one of their mice they sell is like a prophecy from the gods, and like it's absolutely, they're so mad, and I think they're actually mad, and you are not allowed to purchase their mice unless you get a certain score in their aim trainer, which you first have to download. Like so you have to like download, and they're just like
you have to prove yourself worthy.
Yeah, you're not like, this is like this is not like this is a holy object, right? So like you can't even believe how much my kids got into this, because they very literally grinded this aim trainer just to be able to purchase then a mouse for like $70, which is like, and like this is so fun, right? And so all of this. Now, we have all of this going on in Shopify, and then now the internet is transitioning to agentic commerce. This has been your project that you've been working on, frankly, day and night, with very many long phone calls and all sorts of wrangling of basically the industry at this point. The Universal Commerce Protocol, the UCP.
Yep.
UCP is essentially retain the variety of the Bazaar, but in such a way that it's not Shopify having to set up the boundary conditions for the Bazaar anymore. And so talk about the experience of UCP, which is essentially the hardest protocol anyone can imagine making, because
it is. Yeah, we're trying to design a protocol for the humanity's longest running trade, commerce. No big deal, right?
Yeah.
And it needs to model all of the intricacies and complexities of what you just described. Right? I think a common misconception that we have from a lot of our partners coming to us, we're building an agent. Hey, Shopify, give us a checkout API. Well, let me sit you down and tell you that we don't have a checkout API. We have a checkout platform in the same way that we have a storefront platform, right? And when you enter checkout, we negotiate between identity providers, wallet providers, fulfillment providers, different payment methods, loyalty systems. All of those things happen organically, discount engines and customizations. And any part of
different discounts stacking with other discounts, but not others.
And by the way, all that is totally dynamic based on what you put in.
Yes.
Maybe you changed your address, the whole thing reconfigures itself and says, sorry, these payment methods are not available. You can now do a subscription. Now you can't. Like, it is a complicated beast. So it is a bazaar in the sense that there isn't a Shopify checkout. There's hundreds of thousands of different checkouts. And so there isn't a single API, right? But I don't think this is obvious. I think from the outside, for somebody who has not spent years and lived with the pain of all the complexity of commerce, it just seems like, look, a checkout is a line item, a payment method, and a shipping method. Like, what's the big deal?
Yeah, you collect these couple of information, you click a button, you provide a credit card or login, and then money is transferred. And what else could possibly be happening, right?
Right. And there's been many attempts at this, right? I've participated in some of them when I worked on the Chrome browser, when we tried to build the payment handlers APIs or payment request API, kind of the same naivete of, hey, it kind of sucks that you have to manually type out your credit card. No big deal. We can just build a UI for that, right? We can pre-fill all this information. Well, it turns out merchants didn't adopt it or accept it because it's not as simple as that. It is all of the other things in the middle that you have to negotiate through. So in the same way now, agentic is forcing this discussion, but in a roundabout way, where now you have a third participant. Before you had a merchant and a buyer. Now you have an agent who's acting on behalf of the buyer, and that agent needs to negotiate through, right? And that by itself unlocks like layers of new complexity that you have to manage. First of all, I, as a merchant, do I trust this agent? So there's an agent identity question. Second, if I trust you as an agent, so let's say I trust Claude or ChatGPT, do I know who the buyer is? Oh, it's acting on behalf of Tobi. So there's a buyer identity part of it.
Or is it just claiming?
Or is it just claiming, exactly. So how can we prove that it's actually Tobi, right? And then, okay, fine, you proved that it's Tobi, but is it really a good idea to just give you a cookie jar and say to hell with it? Like you can have access to Tobi's credit card and go crazy? No, it turns out that you also want to capture intent and a lot of context about that. How do you do that, right? And that's just the base of this negotiation. And then on top of that, we have all of the complexities of, well, did Tobi want express shipping or did she want to do a pickup because pickup is available for this item? What about discounts? Or, does he have a loyalty program with us?
Or which address does it go to, right? Like,
right.
Maybe this is like a thing that goes to the cottage, right? Like, and it's like, and suddenly this is a different province state, and therefore, all the rules change again. And if I was living in Ottawa, like 4 kilometers away from me, all tax law was different, right? Like, and not even tax law, it was actually all law was different because it switched from civic to common law. Like, so it's like, and what has to be collected at point of checkout. Like, this is Quebec. Quebec has its own set of, so I should.
Well, the US has something over 200 different tax jurisdictions,
yes,
right? So like a lot of the complexity is absorbed.
By the way, some of them, like there's buildings in the United States where the shipping costs and taxes change depending on which loading dock of that building something goes out of.
That I did not know about. That's
so.
That's amazing.
Usually they figure out how to finagle this in a way, but that is actually the way the law is written.
Right.
So it's just like there's enormous complexity, and what's most important is everyone starts out thinking that checkout is a sort of an error. It's like you have no information, you supply information, and then you get to the last point. Hopefully you show a review screen, which sometimes people think you can skip, but most people actually really want to say yes before money leaves their wallets. And then there's a period of where it's packaged and shipped, and then like the transaction is actually the life cycle. For small businesses specifically, it continues. Most small businesses, at least fast-growing small businesses, don't think of the first transaction as often they don't make money of it because that's the cost per acquisition is so high, but they develop a lifetime customer value thing. So they require, this is actually where the real business starts, actually. In many cases, this is incompatible with people, how they think. More importantly, the arrow doesn't work at all. There's a beginning where they declare, it starts, and then it's a loop.
It's an interactive application. Yeah. A checkout is not just a web form. It is a live application that you're interacting with, right? It's refreshing, it's changing its inputs based on your selections. And now you have to model that as a protocol, right? So naively, you could take your agent and just point at a web form and say, go have at it, right? And then just maybe use even vision to navigate. Turns out that's pretty slow and inefficient. It also doesn't solve for all the other layers that I described earlier. So the moment in the industry right now and why it's both interesting and kind of all-consuming is we're inventing everything at once. We're trying to figure out how to do agent identity. There's a Cambrian explosion of proposals for how to do buyer identity and delegation.
Yeah, and they have their own cathedrals and bazaars by themselves. Like lots of people want to do this centrally because it's easier for
Everyone wants to create their own central repository of registered agents, right? But then there's a delegation, and how do you scope that? And then on top of that, you add the complexity of the actual providers, right? Of okay, fine, I'll allow this agent to view the portfolio, but I'm not going to allow you to manage my portfolio because that's a risky operation.
Yes.
Or I need a step up, I need an escalation,
Yes.
I need human in the loop. So some of the naivete right now is that agents will just do everything, right? It's like, no, agents augment what humans can do. And we need protocols that can fail open, where when something is not possible, you can delegate to a human, you can delegate back to a human in a seamless way that doesn't force them to go from the beginning. It's like, look, I tried to check out and I couldn't. Why don't you go
Therefore,
try?
you now have to do it.
Yeah,
right?
you now have
no.
to do it. It's like, no, I got it this far. I hit this particular problem. Now, can you resolve the final mile of it? Like,
Yeah. It's like the kids' summer camp registration of Shopify. And like at some point in checkout, it needs to ask like, hey, does Tommy have any peanut allergies or something like this? And like, that is not something like, on Shopify, like they have an extension and then it asks this and it is being collected or it's gating the checkout if this is not there because it's required. Like if you would build a checkout protocol in naively or would ask people to just like build a API integration, they would never add to their, like to, I don't know, TikTok, to like peanut allergy dialogue, right? That's not what TikTok engineers will work on, right?
Yep.
So I think this is your idea. Was like to what's so interesting about protocol creation is the people who create protocols have to understand the problem really at an atomic level, probably better than any. Like this is my favorite thing about engineering, is that it really requires you to at some point understand the problem probably better than anyone else. Like at least for fleeting, maybe it's 10 minutes, but for 10 minutes, you understand this problem better than any practitioner if you want to crack the code on finding exactly the right way to do something. And the discipline of what makes engineers really good are the people who can do this quickly and repeatedly who just have a way of working themselves into a problem matter. So I think this was another one of those moments where like really in an agentic world, we need the concept of an escalation to a human.
Yep.
And sometimes these escalations can be dealt with directly by an agent if it just happens to have all the information, but sometimes it needs to be able to ask the person. And like this, I think, was the biggest unlock in this protocol, which I think gave us a confidence that it's actually possible to make.
Yeah, it's a combination of, first we can do dynamic discovery, and that brings in a lot of heavy machinery up front, which is not obvious, right? Because there's a much easier way if you could just dictate the exact blueprint for the Cathedral and say, I support one flavor of discount, thank you very much, and I'm done. Instead, we said, you can bring any flavor of discount that you like as long as both parties agree. And then beyond that, what happens when you disagree? That's where you have to stare down that barrel and say, okay, well, there's a concept of escalation, of an escalation. Or maybe there are some business rules that the merchant has that we can't negotiate out yet via an API or via an agentic mechanism. So how do we perform that handoff? Right? And this is not a foreign concept. Like in payments, we've had escalations for a long time. You had to do a 3DS challenge or a step-up challenge. So this is not exactly like breaking new ground, but it is bringing that concept and generalizing it into all of commerce to say, maybe a B2B agent can get you much further, right? Because they've specialized in a certain case, but another agent can't navigate themselves out of a corner where like there's some information that's required. Fine, just pass it back to the human.
It's right. Yeah, like obviously this is not discovery of a completely new idea, but like it is often, it's just sort of a penny drop moment when say like, hey, this thing that we've been doing over years of ad hoc is actually, if we move it to become a primitive and allow it to be utilized for like all problems of this particular shape across in the concept of a checkout, then like the complexity just melts away in a very real way. Like suddenly we can actually take all the checkouts that all our customers have so carefully configured, like the final mouse example. An agent can be like trying to buy one of those mice when they're available, and the escalation is, well, you have not, like your user account on this website does not have the right tags, so therefore you have not done this thing yet. Do you want to tell your human about this, or do you want to send them a link to the tool, or do you how would you like to go about
Maybe
this?
another way to look at it is an agent's kind of like progressive enhancement, right? So where you had to do everything manually before, now you can delegate some portion of your commerce needs to an agent. And over time, one would hope that the agent can do progressively more and more, but you've built it in such a way that it fails open. It says, this is how far I got you, here you go, as opposed to closed mechanism where you just said, this is one particular shape of commerce that you can do, and otherwise you cannot proceed.
Yeah. It's really great work, and we've now had several breakthroughs in recent history with, like, I think really industry consensus that it's the HTTP of how I think commerce works in the world, in digital world in the future.
Commerce, the world of commerce, look a lot more like Shopify, which is to our advantage because that is not friction to our platform. It makes everyone else look closer to how we think about the world and how we model commerce. Yeah. Which is frankly kind of a gift to the industry because we've taken decades, if not more, of experience, accumulated experience. We did not get checkout right on the first try, right? We had many runs at it, and we have effectively standardized the data model now of the hard-won experience of how not to do things.
The shape of commerce from now on is going to work really well for the kinds of customers that we really care about. Because again, like Alo Yoga could be on a custom platform and they're massive and they could basically dictate their requirements to their implementers. And in the absence of a protocol, we saw this early with, this is the way everyone wants to do it. But there's so many problems with this, especially because commerce is such a long tail thing. It's like you want to not find, other yoga people are it's a great example because people love the products and they're really good quality and they win on merit and so on. So it's great to have them. But there's like Alo Yoga quality products in much more niche places, right? It's not Alo Yoga you want to find, it's the Alo Yogas of all niches. And they're all on Shopify, but the niches aren't as big as clothing, and therefore they are you're not going to get to them if you go one at a time. You need millions of merchants.
I'll double up on a positive, which is it is not preordained or obvious that agentic commerce would be net positive to buyers or merchants if it's not done right. Yeah. Like the bar is not, can an agent complete a transaction? Of course it can. That's a trivial example to drive through.
In this case, it just takes over your browser and pretends it's you.
Exactly. It just puts in a credit card and all the rest. But then it'll skip the disclosure about peanut allergy or accept the fact that it's a final return and you can't exchange this thing or all the rest, right? So naively, this actually applies to both sides. As a buyer, using this new agentic world, do I get the same or better outcome as if I did it myself? So as an example, we were chatting about earlier, if we're having a Black Friday sale, but I can't discover or input a discount, that's obviously worse because if I just went to the website and I had a banner that said, put in BFCM 25 or 26, and I got 24% discount, that's an obvious thing that's just kind of amiably present in the header, but never described by the protocol.
Right.
So the agent would have missed it.
Yes.
So the buyer's worse off, or maybe didn't see all the shipping options or the various delivery methods and it couldn't negotiate through that. Right? How do we teach the agents to faithfully represent? That's the buyer side. Yeah. And as a buyer, I would be very frustrated if I didn't get that sort of outcome. Right? Right. As a merchant, same deal, because I'm losing valuable customers if they're not happy. And second, I'm not getting all of the basket building, upsells, all the configuration, all the storytelling. So if you're selling that mouse or you're selling some crafts good, right? You want to be able to navigate the person through that purchase. I think that is why it needs to exist and that's why Shopify needs to author it, because we're the only ones sitting squarely in the middle of that negotiation, understanding the capital P platform that needs to exist in the middle because we've built it, and help participants on both sides, the agent builders, right, and all the systems that we integrate with kind of mediate through that discovery process. Because that's what ultimately our checkout is today. It is a market where merchants can bring apps, extensions, third-party systems. You can bring in your third-party return system, different loyalty programs, custom discount engine, and all of that magically happens to work in the browser.
Exactly, and it happens in the browser, and if it doesn't survive the next platform shift, and the next platform shift kind of removes the ability for these kind of special, differentiation, then I think your point is a very, very good one, that it's not automatically positive. We would lose a huge amount of distinction of businesses, and I think this distinction is important. Again, there are a lot of businesses that sell mice. Like I'm excited about one, other people should be excited about others. It's distinction of products and people exploring the space, sometimes by innovating on the products and sometimes by innovating on community and all these kind of things is exactly what makes the Bazaar interesting, because otherwise you end up having just rows and rows like sort of newly built suburbia, and it does not look like a Bazaar, right? Like, and there's a place for it, but it just like, there's like a vibrancy that is just like lost in that way.
Well, the Bazaar can also wither, right? Because many businesses just opt out. They see the shape of commerce that the first set of agents were proposing, and they said, okay, maybe I'll try it because I'm curious. But then they actually see the orders roll through and they realize all the things they lost in the process, and they just opt out. So the Bazaar closes.
Absolutely. The Bazaar is not around automatically. It's around because we want it to be around. It's like people... it's there as long as some people vote with their dollars that having a Bazaar is valuable. In many, like the story of the last 40, 50 years of especially North America, smaller towns, is the story of people stopping to vote for the Bazaar and voting for the Cathedral, like in the form of the local Walmart or so, right? So the city center shops just for one reason or another, were not found to be appreciated anymore. People did not vote enough with their dollars for them, and therefore the city centers changed the way, like in a way that a lot of people talk about fondly about what it was like before. And so, so the world really, really changes based on how people allocate their, money, and progress, and again the distinction and the vibrancy of products and businesses and brands that we interact with really depends on this, like new business coming along, the sort of breadth first search for all the products that are viable, that entrepreneurs do. And it's really, really easy to forget how fragile this is. And of course, Shopify exists to cause that to not just like be around and sustain, but also like thrive, right? Like if ever we can do it, like again, I think our work on UCP is gonna, I think, in the sort of longer term history, and thanks to you specifically for all the amazing work you've done there. In the Shopify story, will be featuring very highly on where we had a lot of simpler moves available, because of course everyone returns our phone calls. We could absolutely have Cathedral with, but like specifically said, okay, the internet needs this to be open. And there were attempts by protocols that sort of call themselves protocols, but they're closed, which really I don't feel like is actually should be allowed. I guess one-to-N protocols still. Maybe it's not.
I think closed protocols are totally fine when you have a finite set of participants and it's a constrained domain. In fact, you should reach for them when you can, because open protocols are hard, right? They're marketplaces.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's a better way to put it. But it's the hardest thing to do, is to create a protocol, make it something that can be open, and then convince people that it's the one that we should coalesce.
Yeah, and
maybe
maybe
it's the last bit is the hardest.
Consolidate and bring it back, because like protocols can be very abstract to a lot of people. They're like, oh, what does that mean, right? But at the end of the day, it's just abstractions. And software engineering is about building appropriate levels of abstractions. And when they're done right, as you said, right, they just kind of disappear into the ether because you never think about them. Yes. I never have to think about retransmitting packets on the wire, because TCP just beautifully handled that for me, right? And it's only like kind of an academic thing that I learned about for the most part, until you go and try to reinvent quick, and then you realize 50 years of learned experience of how not to retransmit a packet. But whether you're designing a DSL or an API surface that another team will use, like you are in a business of building protocols and abstractions, right? And it's just like taking a step back and understanding kind of, I think with time, you learn how not to do things, and kind of crystallizing that knowledge into good design.
Yes.
That's what this is all about.
Yes. So I think it's, I think protocol design, abstraction design, like making the ones that everyone just like, this works perfectly and I don't have to think about it, is actually the highest form of software engineering specifically. It is the building the Golden Gate Bridge of our industry, right? Like TCP certainly is HTTP, like the file APIs or POSIX.
In the same way that Rails transformed how to build a web app, like Rails is a protocol, right? I vividly remember this feeling, or a moment actually, when I was learning Rails, and it's the first time you approach it is just like it's madness because it's all just magic incantations as far as I can tell.
True.
And then at a certain point, I'm like, oh, wait a second. I think I understand the pattern. What if I just typed this and it ran? And it was like an epiphany moment of like, now I understand the dialect.
Yes. Yeah.
I can speak it.
I know Kung Fu.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And it wasn't without fault, but once you grok it and once you understand it, you're just that much more effective, right? Because it abstracted a lot of the complexity of I don't have to write SQL. I can just do this thing, right? Find by something. It's a piece of magic.
I think this is a perfect place to end this really fun conversation. And again, amazing work on pioneering UCP. Couldn't have done it without you. And it's a fascinating, underexplored topic. Protocols are very important at Shopify. I think we celebrate them because we deem them to be the highest form of a craft. I think this is, it's exciting to go into this completely new platform shift with agentic commerce in a way that we can bring the unvarnished vision of our merchants to this new platform without having to go through a decade of negotiations and trying. It's really, 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 really. This could have gone. If you would rerun this simulation here 1,000 times, I really don't think in many of those.
This is not the dominant outcome.
No. So we have
and credit where it's due. I appreciate the shout out, but while I held the editorial pen on much of it, a lot of credit goes to a lot of Shopify folks that were in the background distilling that knowledge, helping us develop this thing. And I do think this is a gift to the industry, right? It is a self-enlightened interest of ours to give it to the industry. But it is, I think it'll stand the test of time.
Capitalism, the best parts.
Yes.
Very good. Thank you very much, Ilya.
Thanks
for joining me.